This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Since the start of the war in Ukraine, more than 280,000 Ukrainians have resettled in the United States. Elected officials here in Connecticut have shown their support for Ukraine. Connecticut Senator Richard Blumenthal has traveled several times since the start of the war to meet with President Volodymyr Zelensky. Blumenthal has recently introduced a Senate resolution to address the threat Russia poses. And some Connecticut residents have even gone to Ukraine to do what they can to help. In February, we spoke with Larissa Bobby. She's a Ukrainian American that grew up in Manchester, Connecticut. She lives in Kyiv, Ukraine, working as a writer and translator. In her newsletter, A Kind of Refugee, she writes about her life living in a war zone. Larissa returned to Connecticut for a brief visit in July to see family and friends, and she spoke to us about what her life looks like living in Ukraine nearly a year and a half after the war first began. Well, Larissa, thank you so much for being back here with us and in person today. It's a pleasure to have you on. You know, it's been actually 6 months, really, since we've last had this conversation about your experience in Ukraine, and now you're back here in Connecticut in the United States. You know, what was your trip like, and how have you been spending your time here?
Well, it's fantastic to be here in the studio with you, Catherine. It is nourishing to be able to see my family and my old friends. The last time I was in the United States was almost a year ago, and I was very much in a kind of blinders on the side of my face, full out trying to tell people about the war in Ukraine and rally support. And while those things have become no less important to me, just by the sheer duration that the war has been going on for more than a year and a half now, a human being also needs to kind of make space for those things that make you a human being, including your own history. And so it is really important for me to kind of be in the place where I grew up and with people that I have really long, many-year-long relationships. And
you, I think you just painted such a great picture of having to nourish yourself in order to educate or inform people, which is what you do with your blog or your newsletter, A Kind of Refugee. And with the news cycle moving so fast and you being there in person, I think you have a very different view on the situation on the ground, right? Versus, what we hear or what we see in the headlines. How have you seen attention to what's happening in Ukraine change and evolve from, like you mentioned, last year to this moment?
I think the thing that a person who's never experienced living in a war zone or a zone of upheaval, even where, there are serious protests going on or something, it's hard to imagine or really have this understanding that everyday life and violence exist side by side. So, I live in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, and there's a lot of very normal-looking life. And it persists up until that second that a Russian missile explodes and shatters a building and kills somebody. Because of, I think, in the first maybe even year that after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, it was so shocking that, in a sense, people around the world were shocked. And even if they were at a distance from the violence, they were really engaged somehow. And there's only so long that you can feel something if all you're looking at is flat news, 2D images, and a journalistic rendition of events. And so whereas the people in Ukraine feel very strongly every single day, every single second, the urgency that we need this war to end. And there's only one way to end it, which is with Ukraine's victory and making it impossible for Russia to continue attacking Ukraine. People around the world I find that if their everyday lives are more or less the same, it's remarkable to me how unchanged Manchester, Connecticut and the United States are after this year and a half, whereas I'm transformed. Ukraine has transformed, and we've lost so many people.
And you're from Manchester, Connecticut, and you just mentioned that, it hasn't changed here, but you've changed. So when you come back to Manchester, when you come back to Connecticut, what do you bring with you? What are you seeing that's different, even though physically what you're seeing may not have changed?
I function at a different speed, for sure, because in a sense I have adapted to living in a country at war and to living in conditions that are absolutely unpredictable. And so there's a way that I see opportunity in my conditions, even if it's the opportunity to do the laundry. I see something and I do it immediately, which I didn't live that way before. And I see in the people around me, again, because their routines are stable, they can rely a lot more on even imagining that the next day is going to be more or less how they expect it to be. Whereas I just don't function that way. I don't think that way anymore.
Well, and then you mentioned earlier, too, that people are not responding to the same level of urgency. There was that galvanization in the beginning, but like many issues, it tapers off. Do you think it's because they don't feel the threat that Russia is posing? Or, what goes through your mind when you're literally in the trenches, you're on the ground, but life kind of moves on elsewhere in the world, really?
I think it's alarming that people don't see the threat that Russia is posing to the world. Not too long ago, there was a long-awaited NATO summit in Vilnius in the beginning of July. And Ukrainians really were hoping but the Ukrainian presidential administration and diplomats had been working really, really hard for months to, with public statements, with lots of private conversations with leaders all over the world, to get some kind of a firm statement that NATO wants Ukraine to be a member. And this would be a great political decision, first and foremost. It's a political decision that comes with, a promise, defense promise, but already, it would change the relationship between NATO and Russia and Ukraine around the world. And the result of the NATO summit was they did form a special council, like a NATO-Ukraine council. They did decide that, Ukraine can have a more simplified bureaucratic procedure to join the alliance at some point. And this lack of decisiveness really it disappointed Ukrainians tremendously, but it also shows this way that people who don't feel directly threatened by Russia's attack and Russia's violations. There have been so many violations already that have happened of international law, of the law of war, war crimes, genocide. Basically, you had asked about the news cycle. Also, there was this event that happened. The news kind of decided to not take a clear position, but say, well, we're not sure who blew up the dam. We're going to take some time to investigate. Whereas certain, I guess you could say, analysts, public intellectuals that I very much agree with, made the point that this really was a, this was a certain kind of an action by Russia that was not only intended to destroy massive swaths of Ukrainian land and make it unlivable, and Ukrainian people and Ukrainian livelihoods and wildlife, but it was also a test to see how the world would respond to such an audacious and absolute violation. And the world was kind of like, yeah, we'll take our time and look at it. And so this is when I said I was alarmed by the way that people are not seeing the threat that Russia poses. It's this. It's that like things keep happening that people they're very able to kind of turn away from, and it's just one more ugly story in your news feed, and you can control your news feed and keep living your life. But at some point, there is going to be a line when it's not in your news feed and it's in your sky.
Well, I'm curious because there's so much frustration that you're feeling, right? Yeah. Where either it's a slow process or there's no process at all. And I have spoken with people who have mentioned, oh, we need more stories about humans. What happens to humans that will get people to care. But at the same time, we are getting a lot of stories about what's happening to Ukrainians. And yet this is kind of what you just described is what we're seeing. So this is a big question, but what do you think will get people to respond when, on the one hand, we are giving you stories about humans, and on the other hand, you're saying, we need more?
Mm-hmm. I have this conversation with lots of people. It's a question I get a lot. What does caring look like is what it is. Obviously, you're a journalist. You work from the side that shares people's stories with a large audience. I'm also here as a person who's sharing a story with a large audience. But I get frustrated when, like, the responses I get from specific people, they often either it will be like an instant kind of pity commiseration, oh, that's so terrible, or like a what can I do? You tell me what I can do to help. And what I keep urging people to do is that you have to make the effort to think like from where you are, because different people can do different things. I've met several U.S. Army vets in the past several months who have no connection to Ukraine whatsoever, but they have their military experience. They saw what was going on in Ukraine a year ago. And, these are separate people, completely unrelated to each other, but they all made the same decision that, like, this is a genocide. The world is not going to step up to help, and I'm going to physically get on a plane and go to Ukraine and figure out what I can do. So, I mean, that's what they can do. Obviously, if you don't have military experience, there's going to be something else you can do. Some people have more money to share. Some people have organizational talents. But to come back to the original question is like, what I'm missing from people is more like curiosity. Like when people, I have friends and family in the States, not all of them, but, some of them. And it's like maybe they're not like rah, rah, rah Ukraine on an, kind of a showy way, but they ask me very specific questions. What's it like when this happens? What's a good question? I don't know. Even just like asking me about my experience of, what it feels like when there are things exploding outside my window. And through them offering like what they actually need to know, there's a genuineness and it creates this connection. And I'm not one of these people, how to say, obviously I'm grateful for every bit of support that, anyone wants to offer to Ukraine. I have more trust for a person maybe who's a community activist or who is watching the situation in Taiwan in relation to what's happening in Ukraine. And we can have a conversation about that and find common basis. That's more important to me than your blue and yellow flag.
Well, and you mentioned the military, and last month you wrote about spending a week translating for an American instructor training the Ukrainian military. Can you talk about that experience? Especially with what you just shared, you feel this connection with somebody who has no connection with Ukraine, but wants to come and help. Did that change sort of your mindset, or what was that experience like for you?
It definitely made me see something in America that I hadn't really paid much attention before. I definitely changed my understanding of the American military in the sense that before it was something kind of abstract. It was, people join this force, they fight wars for American interests off of American soil, often questionable. And I understood how much the American military is made up of different kinds of people. This particular experience of translating for training Ukrainian military was profoundly transformative for me. Maybe in part because it was something I had dreamed of doing maybe for the past year, because I do work as a translator. I've worked as a translator for over a decade in various capacities. And so it was like, oh, this is a concrete way I can help the Ukrainian war effort. But when it actually came down to it, and this instructor is like, so have you ever translated a tactical medicine course before? And I said, nope. And so I had to, I had to study. He sent me videos of, various kinds of tourniquets and bandages, and I had to figure out how to say all these things in 2 languages. And so as I was translating the actual course, I was also learning what tactical medicine is. And the atmosphere that he creates in his classes is really just bringing people's attention back to the life and death urgency of being on the front line. And so we worked with a couple of groups who were completely fresh recruits, and they were really no different than me. That was also very humbling, that some of these guys really had no more experience handling a rifle than I do, no idea, how to put on a tourniquet, and they have to learn how to do this in 30 seconds or less, because otherwise you will bleed to death. And, just spending a week in this constant repetition that, like, everything you do, somebody's life depends on it.
But I also feel like as a human being, you mentioned where's the line earlier, and there's only so much you can take, but you have to nourish yourself and take care of yourself. I want to do a quick pivot here because you're a writer. I want to ask about your thoughts in terms of the death of the Ukrainian novelist Victoria Amelina. For our listeners who might not know, she was injured and died because of an attack, and she was just having dinner at a pizza restaurant, and I'm assuming this is one of so many stories that you hear. Did it hit different? What was going through your mind when you first heard of that?
Yeah, it hit. It definitely hit home. So she was critically injured in a Russian missile attack on a pizza restaurant in Kramatorsk. As you mentioned, Kramatorsk is a city in the east. And it's kind of a hub as far as it's like the last kind of big major city before the front. And so it's a place where, a lot of volunteers will come to, before heading out to points further in the front. It's a place where military personnel will come back to, have a break. And so there was nothing accidental or arbitrary in that missile strike. In that same missile strike, an American Marine who was fighting in the international brigades was killed, along with teenage twins, and I think there was another teenager killed. So it was very much this is just to illustrate, again, the cruelty with which Russia is waging this war, and it's intentional. I want to just bring that back. I never met her personally. I was hoping to. She was just doing her work. She was a writer. She was interested in where she came from, who her fellow Ukrainians are. So very early on, she trained to become a war crimes investigator and basically traveled around Ukraine interviewing people and listening to stories of unspeakable brutality that they had lived through. And so it's like I was sort of following. I knew what she was doing somewhere, off on the periphery. And it was just something that, was very humbling to me, because it's a person that, like, I could be doing that theoretically, right? And just to know, like when you see how other people live, it's very moving.
And I mean, it's hard to not hear the admiration you have for her. Is there something that you want our listeners to know about her work, or is there a way to carry on, what she was doing? Not to put the burden on any one person, but clearly you have such love for her. Is there something that you would like to share with our listeners?
I think I would like to share a poem that she wrote while she was doing her war crimes investigation work. and it is untitled. In this strange city, only the women testify. One tells me about the child that disappeared. 2 talk about people tortured in the basement. 3 say they didn't hear about the rapes and avert their eyes. 4 talk about screams coming from the headquarters. 5 about people shot in their yards. 6 speak, but it doesn't make any sense. 7 are still counting their food reserves out loud. 8 say I'm lying and that justice does not exist. 9 talk amongst themselves on the way to the cemetery. I'm going there too, for I already know everyone in this city, and all of its dead are my dead, and all the survivors are my sisters. 10 talk about the man who survived. He too was detained by them. He can testify about the torturers. I knock on his door, but his neighbor comes out. She answers for him. It only seems like he survived. Go and talk to the women.
You can find that poem by Victoria Amelina on our website, ctpublic.org/wherewelive. We're listening back to my conversation with Larissa Bobby, a writer and translator from Manchester, Connecticut, who is now living in Ukraine. From Connecticut Public Radio, this is Where We Live. I'm Catherine Shen. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Coming up, Anna Kobalars, a resident of Berlin, Connecticut, talks to us about the Ukrainian organization City of Goodness, an orphanage and family center where she works. Now, we're talking with Connecticut native Larissa Bobby, who has lived in Ukraine since 2005. She's a writer, translator, and dancer. Through performing arts, she's taught movement and rehabilitation classes to soldiers and civilians. I asked her what that work looks like today.
Yeah, I've been dancing since I was a kid, and I've done lots of different kinds of dancing in Ukraine over the nearly 2 decades that I've been there. And I have been teaching movement classes. It's something that I have started to do less frequently, not because there's not a need for it, but because a person has limitations to how much they can do. And what I've more recently, there's, I can explain.
That's okay. Take your time.
The need for rehabilitation, both for Ukrainian soldiers, people in the armed forces, and Ukrainian citizens and civilians and anybody who has been living through this war, is enormous. It will only continue to grow, and it will last for years, decades, generations. That problem is not going anywhere. The thing that I keep coming back to, and I have been for, almost as long as I've been inside of this full-scale Russian attack on Ukraine, the thing that is most urgent is to end the war. And so there are just so many things that need to be done. And one of the ways that I feel is important, and is also something very much that I can do, and that I'm drawn to do, is speaking, writing, translating, in a way that maybe can reach some people to see more clearly what is happening. And I think there is a need for work in the discursive sphere. So one of the things that I'm also trying to do, which hasn't happened yet, is to relaunch an English language magazine about Ukraine, about Ukrainian culture and politics. And a lot of my energy has been going more into working with words. And so that means less in terms of helping people rehabilitate. But obviously, if there were 5 of me or even 3 of me, it should be a full-time job.
I'm nodding my head. No one can see that, but you can see me. I'm nodding my head because you are absolutely doing so much. And it relates to my next question. I want to ask you, you're doing all of this with words and beyond. I want to ask you, where do you see the need for more support, both from the government side and from the people side? Because we learned that based on the Department of Defense, the U.S. has provided billions in security assistance to Ukraine, and President Joe Biden has condemned the Russian invasion. He has called Vladimir Putin a war criminal. And, as you know, many people here in the United States have shown their support in whatever way they can, and as we talked about earlier, displaying a Ukrainian flag. But where do you see there is more need for that urgency, that support from both the government side and from people?
I think this is the hardest thing to put into words, actually. It has to do with, feeling, not as a feeling, but like genuinely realizing the reality of what is happening. I don't want each of you to have to lose so many of your close friends, hundreds of thousands of your compatriots in the course of a year to be able to understand that this is real and it has to stop. I think everything that the U.S. government has been doing, I think that, public statements that President Biden has been making, I think it's great. I don't have anything to criticize as far as what people are doing. Your Ukrainian flags in your windows are beautiful. I appreciate it. But the thing also that has happened in Ukraine that Ukrainians have been forced to see is to understand that the life of their nation, the fact if their nation is going to be here tomorrow or not, it depends on them and on each one of them. Some critical mass of Ukrainians have understood this. Not all Ukrainians understand this, but enough Ukrainians have understood this that they're fighting and staking their lives and giving everything they have and more in order for Ukraine to survive and for Ukraine to persist.
With what you're saying too, I'm wondering, what do you think is impacting the level of involvement in the war by other Western countries? I'm sure this is something you've thought of / considered.
I do think people understand that something very serious is at stake. I don't think they understand maybe the degree of urgency. Again, these individual American vets that I've met, they are fighting. I mean, they're American patriots, first of all. And so what they're doing by helping Ukraine is really in American interests, so that our democracy can survive. Because obviously, every inch of territory that we cede to Russia, and it's not because it's Russia. It's because of the way that Russia is operating. It's not because Russians are bad somehow innately. What Russians are doing is absolutely unconscionable. It's easy to want to believe that the Russian people that are supporting the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it's a vast majority of the population, it's not just one Putin. People here want to believe that they're just, brainwashed, or they're just being oppressed. Really, they would like everything to be democratic, but they can't speak up because they're afraid or something. But it's too, at this point, you have to see the reality of the war. And so not speaking up, it doesn't matter if you're afraid, for whatever reason. I think in Russia proper, it's too late because of what has happened in its government for years and decades. And so this is another thing to kind of remind Americans is that now is the moment where you have to be aware of what's going on around you in your own political life. It's gotten very hairy in the sense that people speak through what they see in the internet. There's, a lot less neighbor-to-neighbor communication and a lot of just, people have information brought to them in their homes and then they spout it out. And that's a big change in our political discourse.
And with what you're saying, do you feel like those people responsible for this violence, for this attack, will ever be held accountable for what they've done to Ukraine? What does that accountability look like to you?
It depends. I think here, actually, to a large extent, it depends on the West, because obviously Ukraine, from the beginning, we had mentioned, Victoria Amalina was doing war crimes investigations. She's not one, but she's part of a large community of people who immediately, journalists, for example, they realized that it's not enough just to write stories, but they studied, international law, and there are certain ways that you have to write testimony so that it will be legitimate evidence in court. And so Ukrainians have this in mind. They're collecting war crimes testimony. They're collecting evidence. But I'm thinking of Nuremberg, right? Like there has to be, in order, this war is being waged on a larger scale. It may be happening on Ukrainian territory, but it is absolutely a world order, world scale war in that sense. So will Russia be held accountable? It depends on whether, NATO countries, whether the U.S. decides that Russia needs to be overcome in this war, or are we still going to try to find some way to negotiate? Because basically any kind of negotiations are going to legitimize not only Russia's power in the world, but it's going to legitimize every single atrocity that Russia has committed over the past year and a half.
Well, I know we've gone through a lot in this short conversation, and I do want to touch on, because you're here in Connecticut, you grew up here, you have family here. When are you going to return to Ukraine? And when people ask you why you return to Ukraine to continue to do your work there, how do you respond? What goes through your mind when you get asked that question?
I'm going back to Ukraine in a couple of weeks, and for me, there's no question. Even though I did grow up in Connecticut, I've been living in Ukraine since 2005, and it's very much my home. It's my home kind of in a practical sense, and very much in a heart sense. My grandparents were all from Ukraine, so even if the individual story, how I ended up there, is another long story, the right now of it is that this is my home. I have to defend it because I can't rely on someone else to defend what is most important to me. And I think that's a principle that anyone can apply to themselves too.
I've got about 2 minutes left here, but I want to ask, what do you hope our listeners take away from this conversation that we're having right now?
I hope that you can imagine the Ukrainian people who are fighting in Ukraine, who are defending their country, who live in a place where you never know when a Russian missile might arrive and explode, God forbid in your bedroom, but nearby. They're the same kind of people as you. And they have a homeland. I think a lot of them didn't necessarily feel a strong connection to their country or their government. It was complicated. But Russia's full-scale invasion has forced Ukrainians really to clarify who they are, what they stand for. And I wish for you to, maybe seeing what's happening halfway around the world, ask yourself some questions so that it doesn't have to come to missiles falling in your backyard.
That was Larissa Bobby. She is a writer and translator from Manchester, Connecticut, now living in Ukraine and aiding the war effort. You can find a link to her newsletter, A Kind of Refugee, on our website, ctpublic.org/wherewelive. Coming up next, we hear from a resident of Berlin, Connecticut, who is working to provide safety and shelter for women, children, and animals displaced by the war. This is Where We Live. I'm Catherine Shen. Stay with us. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Catherine Shen. Today, we're talking to residents of Connecticut that are aiding the war effort in Ukraine. The war has meant more Ukrainian children are in need, many without homes and parents to care for them. Joining us now is Anna Kobalars, a resident of Berlin, Connecticut. Anna is very active within her own Polish community in the state, and after a single visit to the City of Goodness Project, which is a shelter for women and children in Ukraine, she's gone back more than a dozen times since the start of the war to raise money and care for children living there. She's the president of the nonprofit Community Help and is currently raising money for the City of Goodness Project in Ukraine. I started our conversation by asking her about her first visit.
When I arrived there, the reason why, because we were going to support them with the generator. They needed because of the power outrage. And I thought I go and I wait when the generator is going to be delivery. Maybe I will spend there, and don't forget, as it's a war, is like going through from Poland to Ukraine, traveling is kind of like something. So I'm thinking I probably will stay maybe 2-3 days, and you hear all the time on the news is like a war and bombing and all of kind of a situation. Not easy to adjust, but I still going there, and with the thought I will stay there a few days. I'll end up staying 2 weeks.
And you're from Berlin, Connecticut. Can you talk about how stark that experience was? You just mentioned you thought you were going to be there for 2-3 days, and you end up staying there for 2 weeks, and you've actually been in and out of Ukraine and Connecticut over the last couple of years, right?
Yes, since February last year, and till now, I crossed the border, Ukrainian border, 12 times, going back and forth with the humanitarian support, with taking care of. For the first time when I went and saw children in the City of Goodness, I just fell in love with this place, with those children. And I thought to myself, I cannot just say bye. I told them I will come back. And a few weeks later, I came back. And then again and again and again. So it's like very emotional.
And there was clearly a need for an organization like this for these children. And you've been there since the Russian invasion happened and up until now. Has there been a bigger need to have this kind of organization since the start of the war?
Yes, because like I was mentioned before, this place takes children, orphans, dogs. Like it's a place for many who needs shelter. And we support City of Goodness from the beginning, like this generator before we sent we knew 67 orphans are coming, so we sent them like a truck with the pillows, with the all of kind of stuff, medication, with the blankets, just before I arrived there. So we sent the support. And over summer, last year, we sent 22 pallets to the City of Goodness. And also, I raised money to support building 2 orphanages, rehabilitation center. And for those kids, is hard because more kids are coming, more like mothers with the small kids are coming, and we have a place for them to stay.
And can you describe what that place looks like? What does the community look like? You mentioned this is a shelter primarily for mothers and children and animals, actually. What is it like to be there?
It's like a one big family. Like we understand the situation, and but Marta, the founder of the City of Goodness, when I asked her, what do you think about this place? And she said, this place have to be the example for other places, and we have to give our children like a normal. That's like something impossible during the war to give a normal life, or childhood. But that's what we are trying to do. So
right, and you also talked about there's mothers and children, and are there any children in that organization who don't have parental figures, or do they look for parental figures within the organization?
Some kids there are orphans, and so far, maybe not up to today, but I think that was like probably 50 of kids adopted.
And can you talk about what some of these children and families have been through before arriving to the shelter? You know, a lot of them have now lived a lot of their lives among war, among trauma, and some spend time in shelters or basements to stay safe during this wartime. You know, how are they doing, and what was it like for them?
There is many different stories in the City of Goodness. Every mom who came with a child, with children, have a story to tell. Children like arriving from different part of the war zones, and they are welcome in the City of Goodness. And I remember I can share with you the story about two little boys. So we brought to the City of Goodness, and the father died from the explosion of the landmine, and mother couldn't. She was just like devastated. So she asked to leave her two boys in the City of Goodness for some times. And me and Marta, we went to get those little boys, talking about a few months, and the other maybe 3 years old. And we have no like a car seats. We were not prepared. We just went there to the village, and we took those little boys, and I was holding in my arms one of them, and I was thinking how terrible the situation is. They didn't understand why they are sitting with me in a car. They look at me like a completely stranger, but they were just quiet. And some stories very sad. I don't think a lot about why I'm doing this. It's just like so normal, like something, so I know I have to do it. So I don't have any question in my mind if I should, I shouldn't, and why I'm doing that. That's for sure. Always like I look at my mission is something, so I make the mind on the very beginning, and I just keep going.
And I know we kind of talked a little bit about it earlier, but what attracts you to keep coming back to this organization and going back to Ukraine, especially during wartime? You know, you share with us that you crossed the border 12 times, and it sounds like you're going to continue crossing those borders.
Yes. And traveling to explain, maybe to just give an idea how it looks, is not easy, because it takes all day long for me to go back, and sometimes even longer to come back from a City of Goodness through the border and going back to Poland, because that's how I go. So what attracts me to go back and forth is, I think, that my commitment with those kids, the smiling faces, like they know when I come, I always bring them some stuff with me, toys or something. Like I was just showing you this card for a kid who needs, disabled kid who needs to have, something so she can be taken outside with for a rehabilitation center. So it's always something. So I know that when I come, then I work before I come to have some list. The items on the list happen. So recently we were working on a medical beds to get for a City of Goodness, for a rehabilitation center and a hospice. And we have someone who pledged that to buy those beds, and that was expensive stuff. So we're talking about, it's not like something, so we have to really,
And while you continue to do this work and you continue to take care of the children and help expand the organization, because the war is still ongoing, this conversation is still ongoing, what do you foresee to be the biggest challenges when it comes to wanting and needing to take care of these children? Is it the medical supplies? Is it the schooling? Or what would you say is the biggest challenge?
I think that medical is very important for those children because I think that many, if not all of those kids over there and during the war time develop PTSD and like all this mental psychological help is needed for them. I'm not even talking about like a physical or rehabilitation for those sick kids who have other problems.
Are they able to get mental health support? Is that something that's available now, or is it something, clearly there's a need for it?
Yeah, in a City of Goodness it is, but it will be more. It will be much more needed.
And one last question is, what do you hope our listeners can take away from this conversation?
The war is still there in Ukraine, and children need support. They need our support because they're not able just to do everything by themselves. Like even people in the City of Goodness, Marta, she needs support of us.
Well, thank you so much, Anna, for being here with us today and sharing your story. It's a very important experience to share with our listeners.
Thank you for having me.
That was Anna Kobolars, a resident of Berlin, Connecticut, and also president of the nonprofit community HELP. She's raising money for the City of Goodness project in Ukraine, and she's also the director of the humanitarian mission of the Polish American Foundation of Connecticut. We'll have links at ctpublic.org/wherewelive. I'm Catherine Shen. Today's show is produced by Tess Terrible. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Download Where We Live anytime on your favorite podcast app, and thank you so much for listening.